I am honored to welcome Dr. Sig Snap, Sustainable Agri-Food Systems Director at the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMMYT, who will kindly give an introduction to the seminar. Dr. Snap, over to you. Your micro is muted.
Thank you so much. So, in fact, it's a great honor to be able to introduce Brendan Brown. So, he has really impressed me in the short time I've known him, since I just joined as program director here in January. And I was very fortunate to first meet him at this mechanization meeting. It was over 200 people talking about mechanization in Bangladesh. And I think he really lived up to his title in terms of innovation, science. He put up all these different posters that were kind of a rapid assessment from some surveys with questions around each poster. So it was like an immediate feedback approach to trying to understand, what do we know about mechanization, women's roles, different aspects along the whole value chain of mechanization. So that to me was kind of living in example in practice of innovation. So Dr. Brown has a PhD on participatory impact pathways for sustainable intensification in Eastern and Southern Africa, and indeed has worked in the area of SIMLESA, and which is kind of a famous group that tried to look at those pathways. He's gone on to work in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, so he's really a global citizen. Has published recently on such diverse topics as smallholder farmers and digital advisories, understanding decision processes in fee-for-hire services, and farm mechanization in Nepal, policy context, drivers and options. So in fact, he's tried to understand farmers' voices and this whole, what is adoption, and getting our arms around these really complex issues of innovation science. So he is moving on soon, but we'll, I hope and trust, continue to work with us, and we'll continue to learn with him. So I'm really excited that he's going to talk today about what is adoption. So over to you, Brendan Brown. Looking forward to this talk.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Zeke. I'll just share again. Great, so hopefully my screen is up there. So as Zeke has indicated there, this is one of my great passions, and it's a really great opportunity to be able to speak to everybody today about what do we actually mean by adoption. And interesting from a CIMMYT perspective is that I'm actually going to draw on 5 different projects that I've worked on over the last decade or so. So from Africa with the SIMLESA program funded by ACIAR, and 2 more ACIAR funded projects, Surfsea and Rupanta, which work in the Eastern Gangetic Plains, and also pulling on the projects CSIRO in India and in Nepal, and CSIRO in Bangladesh. So trying to bring in a few different geographical contexts to this presentation as well, to keep everybody interested. So, as we said, what is adoption? Some questions that I'd like to pose now, and hopefully your answer at the end of this half hour or so will be quite different to what you might answer in your head now. So the first one is adoption binary? Is adoption a process, or is it an outcome? What is the best way to understand adoption? So I'm sure everybody has in their minds some answers there. So let's see if we can get to something a little bit different at the end. And the aim of what I want to do now is to frame out, or to provide some frameworks that I've applied in these projects to start to think about and push our understanding around what do we mean by adoption. Of course, the starting point here is how we generally understand adoption, and that is through binary adoption. What does that mean? So you have a simple question. Do you use this technology or practice? If you do, you're an adopter, and if you don't, you're a non-adopter. So this is tried and tested, and it's used because it's quite simple to use. It's quite easy to understand. Examples, you might say that 81% adopted and 19% didn't. So these are actual numbers, that these 81 and 19 that we drew from an analysis in the SIMLESA project around conservation agriculture. So what we said was 81% use and 19% don't use conservation agriculture. But what if we were to take our understanding to the next level and break apart use and non-use? So the first thing that we see is that while 81% of farmers used some aspect of conservation agriculture, in fact, nobody did the true definition or the FAO definition or the most fully functional way of doing conservation agriculture. And as you can see in that bottom right-hand corner, that's because conservation agriculture is an amalgamation of 3 different practices. And this presentation definitely isn't about conservation agriculture in itself, definitely about how we talk about adoption. But the first point is to think about when we talk about adoption and particularly technology adoption, what do we actually mean by that technology? But the point here about talking about adoption is that although we have this huge percentage adoption, it's not actually true adoption. Now, the other aspect is this non-use, 19%. So immediately our minds go to a point that says non-use means don't like. What we actually find is that's not generally the case. So the majority of non-use was simply a lack of information about conservation agriculture. The negative evaluation aspects of non-use were actually a very small component of that. So these are the sorts of things that we need to start to unpack when we talk about understanding and framing adoption, not just use and non-use, but the next level down from that. So the question then that we would pose when we talk about binary adoption is saying or reporting or writing somewhere in a document 81% adoption. Is that actually helpful to us understanding what's actually happening in communities, what's actually happening on farmers, on plots and farms and by farmers? So what then is adoption? Are there different types of adoption and non-adoption? Can we scratch deeper? Can we start to learn more? And that helps us, of course, in making our research more impactful. So here's where we started with our binary adoption and non-adoption. And this is something that was published in Agricultural Systems. What we can say is actually there is lots of different types of adoption and non-adoption. The way that we framed it in this paper was to look at a series of steps that you go from learning into evaluating and then eventually using or not using. So whilst we have these different stages, what we can do is then place them in a logical order. We start with exposure into non-trial assessment, trial assessment, and then utilization. Essentially, 100% of a population starts at unaware of a technology or practice when it doesn't exist. What we want to get to as researchers trying to create impact in communities is to get those technologies, those practices into use. So how do we get from unaware, 100% of the population, to 60, 70, 80, 90% of farmers in a particular population utilizing? So this was called the process, or is called the process of agricultural utilization framework, published in Ag Systems in 2017. What we then did when I moved across to South Asia was to apply that in the sense of mechanization. So what we've done is essentially the same framework, but then added in an ownership component because we have these machines that are obviously integral in smallholder systems to be owned, but then also to be providing services as well. So this is published also in Agricultural Systems, but more recently in 2021, called the Stepwise Process of Mechanization Framework. And so we've applied that to SURFC and CSIRO data. The core idea, though, is that we get away from this just percentage adoption and we start to think about what proportion of a community have information constraints, what proportion have negatively evaluated, what proportions are users or potential users, meaning they're showing interest or they're being supported, but they just haven't reached that unassisted user stage. And then we have owner, and then the next step is service provider. Though when we apply this, the numbers are so small that they're a little bit difficult to work with. So an example of how you would apply these stepwise frameworks. So here is a study that we applied with data across the Nepal Terai, east to west. And against, I think it's 9 different machines there. And what we could say is that 3 of those machines, being the combine harvester, the 4-wheel seed drill, and the 2-wheel reaper, have some level of adoption there, ranging up to nearly 1/3 of the population. The rest quite low in their adoption rates, less than 5%. So that might be where we stop with the binary adoption, or we might run some statistical analyses that looks at characteristics of adopters and non-adopters. But that's generally where our adoption studies tend to end. So what we did is we applied that stepwise process of mechanization framework to start to understand and piece together proportionally within communities, what are the dominant typologies that are occurring. So basically on the left of the graph, that yellow is unaware, and on the far right in the greens are the users and owners. So what new information can this provide to us? So again, on the left-hand side, they're your binary adoption numbers. But let's look at the 4-wheel tractor seed drill. So we said 30% binary adoption. Obviously, what we're missing there is that actually nearly 45% of the population that was surveyed have used the 4-wheel tractor seed drill at some point. Interestingly, though, it breaks up into thirds. So 1/3 have already disadopted the use of the 4-wheel seed drill. Of the 30% then, half of that are currently supported to use that seed drill. So the actual adoption rate that we see there is more like 15 or 16%. So that's really important when we think about the story of what's occurring. How is adoption occurring in a community? What is the status of adoption? Trying to piece together some of the different components of adoption that start to tell a story. And again, fertilizer spreader, it's 3%. So there's not a whole lot of adoption there. But again, we see that supported use is the dominant typology when we talk about the different types of users or different types of adopters there. When we look at the 2-wheel tractor reaper, we start to get a bit of a different story here. So although binary adoption is 10% less across the population, we can see that actual use or actual adoption is actually higher than the 4-wheel tractor seed drill. A lot less subsidized use or supported use and a lot less negative evaluation. And actually we see some ownership there as well. And then if we look at the combine harvester, we can see actually that there's very low disadoption and very low supported use. So there's some different stories that start to emerge when we start to break apart the types of adoption that are occurring within communities. And if we were to go to the non-use side of things, obviously all of the yellow and the orange that you see there are suggesting information gaps. So it's not necessarily that farmers are saying that these aren't right for me. It's saying that they're not even aware enough to evaluate yet. So we've applied this also in Bangladesh as well to look at 24 different machines across a survey of about 1,000 farmers in 10 different districts. So again, we can start to see some difference. And obviously, when you look down this, we do see that different machines are at different stages of their adoption. Again, the key one to look here is that yellow, so unaware. So we do see that depending on the machine, and that obviously depends on how long they've been in communities and other factors that come in, who's been promoting. But there are some differing stories that can be told there. But overall, we do see that information, not surprisingly, is a key constraint to non-adoption. Another thing to consider when we look at comparing binary adoption rates to a more in-depth analysis is where particular technologies might not be relevant. So particularly if we look at the irrigation. So we do see that large proportions of populations don't have access to particular water sources. So if we look at that diesel centrifugal pump, the first one in the surface water irrigation, what we see is that of the, shall we say, eligible population, it might actually be about 80% adoption. Whereas if we were to take a binary look at that, it's about 20% adoption. So we have to be aware of these different subpopulations when we start to talk in more depth about adoption. And interestingly, if we were to go back to those Nepal results, we do see that there's a tendency to be supported or assisted adoption. When we did the same questions in Bangladesh, we saw that assisted adoption was much, much lower. So even between two countries that by border are less than 25 kilometers apart at one point, very different adoption contexts that are occurring. So these are the sorts of stories that we have to unpack a little bit more when we talk about adoption. Now, this is a new form of analysis that we're trying here through SURF-C and through CSIRO-MEA, and that's a pathway analysis. So having a look at how did particular farmers get to their end typology? Were they supported along the way? Did they stop along the way? So again, on the very left, everybody starts at completely unaware, and then they progress along this chain until they get to some form of use. So what we have here is the two-wheel power tiller. A few things to look at. So this is in Bangladesh. So we said there wasn't a lot of assisted use. This is actually ever assisted. So what we see is that 99% of farmers who have ever used the two-wheel power tiller never received any support in order to enable that use. We also see quite substantial ownership in a smallholder situation. So 15% of the whole population surveyed owned a two-wheel power tiller. Now let's compare that to some results from Cooch Behar in West Bengal in India, and this is for the four-wheel multi-crop planter. This is important because we often cite Cooch Behar or cite North Bengal as an emerging space of conservation agriculture in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. And what's really different here is that about 60% of those that had ever used the four-wheel multi-crop planter had done so through receiving some financial or in-kind support to do so. So a very, very different context when we talk about adoption rates. However, when we look at once they were supported to if they're still supported or if they still use, and do they do so without support, i.e. graduation from support to full use, it's really, really low. The result there is 3%. So 3% of those who were ever supported to use the four-wheel multi-crop planter in Cooch Behar have actually gone on to use it without support. And that raises big questions about the sustained adoption of different technologies, and in this case of the four-wheel multi-crop planter. So being able to trace that pathway from you received support to you went on and did it by yourself without us is huge in understanding the context of adoption. Here's two more results. So on the left, we have the four-wheel rotavator, and on the right, we have the diesel centrifugal pump for groundwater. And the reason I share these two is because they've got about the same binary adoption rate. So 53% for the four-wheel rotavator and 61% for the diesel centrifugal pump. But just looking at them visually, we can see that they are very different adoption contexts. So the first one is you'll see that ownership is very substantial for the diesel centrifugal pump in terms of smallholder situations. So ownership at 32%, less than 1% for the four-wheel rotavator. So already we have to start to think about what are the implications on service provision, service recipients, for example. The second one is that we have 16% of the population that simply don't have access to groundwater. So we've got to factor that into what this means for the adoption context. So that binary adoption rate for the diesel centrifugal pump is already artificially low if we consider that 16% of the population never even considered using it because they didn't have groundwater access. And what we talked about with ownership, we can actually see coming through in our disadoption and the reasons for disadoption. So in the case of the centrifugal pump, 13% inhibition rate. So people who stop using the diesel centrifugal pump tend to do so because they want to. If we go across to the four-wheel rotavator, it's about 50%, which means half of the people who have disadopted do so not because they thought that it was a bad machine, but through other factors like the ability to access that machine. So although they have quite a similar binary adoption rate, they have very different adoption contexts. So we just talked about how there's the temporal aspects to adoption as well. So it's all well and good here on the left to look at the adoption across the Eastern Gangetic Plains of the rotavator. So a ubiquitous machine that exists and has been really well adopted in a lot of places across South Asia. But what we can also do is start to think in a temporal way. First, awareness occurs, then adoption occurs, and ultimately you would expect that it will be superseded by something better eventually. So we can develop these curves that come to start to try and look at what was the process that occurred over time here. So it's something that can be really powerful, which we'll see in the next slide. So what we have here is the awareness, ever adoption, and current use curves for the mechanical rice transplanter. Some of the things that we can start to unpack when we create these curves. We can see that around 2013, 2014, 2015, awareness rates were all pretty similar across the Eastern Gangetic Plains, across these 6 surveyed geographies. Moving on from 2015, we start to see this divergence in awareness that comes. So there's really interesting questions that we ask around, why is it that in Cooch Behar, we got to an awareness rate of nearly 60%, when in Bangladesh, in the 2 sites in Bangladesh, we only got to about 25%. Start to unpack, what was it? What were the initiatives that were run in India, in West Bengal in particular, that created that awareness difference compared to, in the same time period, Bangladesh? There's also a question there on why are we seeing awareness plateau at these rates? So that could be potentially related to COVID. It could be potentially related to the projects that were running or weren't able to run at that period of time. We also can start to see some disadoption that's coming in there in the later years, more recent years. The same thing with the combine harvester. We can see that awareness rates really differ despite in 2007 all being the same. But one I wanted to pick out here particularly is Rangpur. You can see there 80% awareness, but when we look down at the adoption rate, it's really peaked at about 20%. So we need to start to unpack these sorts of things, and we can use these adoption curves, these awareness curves, in order to understand that. And of course, we can use these to start to think about technological substitution. So if we actually look here at the 2-wheel power tiller around the late 2000s, we start to see in some communities some markable disadoption. At the same time, in the same time period, we start to see this really steep uptake in the 4-wheel rotavator. So that in terms of adoption, to see adoption over a 10-year period that goes from less than 5% to above 80%, is something, there's a story there to be told, but it's also important in comparing the 2 different machines. So we're starting to see that, yes, we can compare and there's some good learnings that can be there. But as people who are in the CG system, we really want to learn about how we can actually promote, extend. What can we learn from these trends? And often we're raising a lot of questions that we might not have answers to. But of course, that's good for the social researchers that are around our teams. So that means that we really need to think more about the process. So we've talked a lot, we tend to talk a lot about adoption. But of course, adoption only occurs when we come through these different phases. We've got to be aware, we've got to learn, we've got to assess and test, we're going to use, and then if we like it, we might have some sustained adoption. The work that is really powerful to me is when we look at each of these as a process and start to unpack, what does that mean for us? What can we actually do here in order to catalyze change? Of course, what we want is we want speed to peak adoption, and we want a high level of peak adoption. So how do we actually achieve that? So the answer that I've been working on, or the structure that I've been working on for about a decade now, is structured qualitative research. So qualitative research, many people might be scared of it because it is really in-depth. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of skill, and it's also generally hard to do as part of a team because there's so much interpretation that comes into qualitative research. So what I've been trying to do is to try to create a code book, a set of structure that we can look at qualitative data to try and make sure that we can actually analyze it in a way where if we change projects, if we change technologies, we've still got a structure that can help us understand that. So on the left, you've got the livelihood platforms approach, published back in 2017. On the right, we have the decision-making dartboard, which essentially is a 2D version. So it's a top view of the livelihood platform approach. And these all are vaguely based on the sustainable livelihoods framework as well. Of course, with that, we need the data to go with it. So these don't really work for large quantitative surveys. These do need a lot more time with respondents, a lot more structure around what we're asking, because we're asking why now. We're not asking what, but we're asking why. So we generally do this through Snowball sampling methodologies. And the two Snowball samplings are up there on the left for SIMLESA and on the right for SERFC, just to give you a gauge on the sort of data. What we're talking about there in SIMLESA was 325 semi-structured interviews across 20 communities. On the right, we're talking about 288 across 17 communities. So this is where we go in generally with two quite well-trained, not enumerators, but explorers, scientific explorers. We have a team of those in South Asia now, sitting in Nepal. And we do these really in-depth analyses in each community. So what are the processes and what can we learn from them? So starting off, as I said, we always start with awareness. So the question is, how can we catalyze awareness of emerging technologies and practices? So the first one is just looking and quantifying that awareness gap. So these do come from large quantitative surveys. Both of these presented are more than 5,000. On the left is in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. So what we see when you see the orange, that's the information gap that's being quantified. So as you can see, it's generally pretty big. What we've got there under the 5 locations there is in India, where we tend to say we've had the greatest uptake in West Bengal. You can see that it does vary between communities as well. So it's something to explore there. Why are certain communities only having an awareness gap of 15% when others are up above 90%? Same on the right side. So that's across the SIMLESA core countries, where except for Mozambique being an outlier there, we do see these substantial gaps. So we know, obviously, that these gaps exist. When we look at actually mapping awareness in a community, again, we can see these years where quite rapidly awareness is increasing, but at different rates for different technologies. So there's questions there. Why is that? The same, if you look at the scale there, the top line there is 60%. So we're really plateauing, not where we want to be. What is it we need to do to address this? One of the theories that came out of my PhD in the SIMLESA work is that we tend to have this assumption that farmers want to gain awareness from other farmers in their community. There's lots of different theory that comes in behind that. When we did this really in-depth study that looked at why information gaps persist, so this is published in Agricultural Education and Extension, what we find is that the theory's there, but in practice, there's a lot of compounding issues that come in, but particularly that the social structures that exist in these communities actually imply jealousy, distrust, frustration, disharmony, and limited information exchange. When we create these lead farmers and empower them, we're not necessarily going to get what we want. So there's some summarized quotes from the different farmers that we talked to there. And if we think about the context of South Asia, then, well, it's actually communal structures are even more complex in the way that we have far higher disparity and differences in wealth. We have caste, we have cultural context that can make it even harder for that to occur in the South Asian setting. And linked with awareness, then we have learning. So, okay, if a farmer knows that a practice exists, how do we get them knowing enough that they're ready to assess? So some really interesting points that flow on. So on the left here is results from 1,000 Bangladeshi farmers. The one that I really want to pull out again is other farmers, so the purple there. So whilst 42% of the sample said their main information source was other farmers, only 15% actually wanted their main information source to be other farmers. So you can see that purple reallocating to different groups there. Something really interesting that was actually replicated in our CSIRO data as well. So the red meaning really low satisfaction. So regardless of location, caste, age, education, number of agricultural members or gender, farmers just didn't want to learn from other farmers. Where they did want to learn was government extension. Some of the other interesting things are that different locations actually preference different things. So if you look at Rangpur there, nobody was satisfied with farmer groups, but everybody was really satisfied with local organizations. You can get the opposite there in different locations. But if you look at farmer groups, if we look at caste and farmer groups, the lower caste that you were, the less inclined you were to be satisfied with farmer groups. If you look at age, the younger you are, the less likely you were to want to engage in farmer groups. The more agricultural members you had, the more likely you were to engage in farmer groups. The takeaway here is that information systems are really, really complex, but the important thing is we start to understand, because if we go in with one set way of engaging with farmers in trying to help them learn, we may be empowering different subpopulations that we don't necessarily need to empower as much as others. Another example there is in terms of local organizations and the type of individual in the household. So you can see that female heads really didn't have a high satisfaction with local organizations, whereas male heads or female spouses did. So these are really important things to understand about how learning occurs. And just quickly, we also have data that looks at who gave training and what outcome did you get. So if we look at business, we can see that business is really good at creating binary adoption, but actually a lot of it is supported. If you look at NGOs, they're really good at creating awareness, but not creating adoption. So we haven't actually got to the bottom of this. We sort of ran out of time with CSIRO, but there are some things that are really useful to start to learn and unpack when we think about how do we create learning environments, what is the best way to do it. If we move along then, we've got this subset in the population that have enough information, that are assessing, that are saying that they like it, but they're not actually progressing. So if we look here, if we go from A, familiar, into not used, 97% of farmers that we surveyed in the EGP that said they had never used a zero-till drill but were aware of it, said that they wanted to. This means that something's holding them back. It's not just that they think that zero tillage is not good. Overwhelmingly, nearly always, it was that something else is holding them back. And it's the same sort of story for testing. We talked about those that have used with support, 60% for the zero tillage drill. But those that have actually graduated from support to constant use, that G line there, it's really small. You probably can't even see it on a small screen. It's just 4%. So something is holding back this progression, this testing, this positive evaluation from getting information to actually using. So we did an in-depth study as part of CSIRO, a really in-depth qualitative study that started to try and understand the decision processes. So not just trying to quantify, but actually understand from the lived experience, what was it that meant that they knew enough, that they had the information, that they wanted to use it, but they couldn't actually get to use. And there's various reasons, and it's always hard to summarize this into one neat little figure. But some of the key themes came that there was this expectation of support to catalyze change. And I think it's really important that that's not categorized as you're lazy, or, you know, you just want money, you just want fertilizer, you just want seed. That's because of the financial situation and the limited risk-bearing capacity that they actually have to change. So it's not just a hunger to get free things, but it's a fact that a lot of the time, the things that are being promoted, the practices, the machines, the technologies, don't quite fit into every farmer's basket of options. What we also see when we talk then about this using process, we can see, so this is data from Nepal, and this is specifically for those who have ever used. So 6 of the 9 technologies there had more than a third of farmers disadopting. And if you look at the 2-wheel seed drill and the laser land leveler, nearly 2 in 3 that had ever used had disadopted. So it's a question of, why are we getting such high disadoption of machines in Nepal? One of the assumptions that we often make is because they think that it's a bad technology, so they choose to disadopt. If we look at the zero-till drill here, for those that have stopped, what we see is that 62% of people who have stopped using the zero-till drill, it's not because they thought it was a bad machine or a bad practice. It's other factors that are limiting them. So again, really important to think, disadoption doesn't mean negative evaluation. We have to understand why that's occurring. Where this trend is also there in Eastern and Southern Africa as well. So we've done an in-depth study there in Eastern and Southern Africa, so published in the International Journal of Ag Sustainability. What we basically get to again is the resources that are required to use conservation agriculture. They're not there, they can't access supplementary resources, but a lot of the time this is because of that enabling environment that we're setting up, or cultural applicability. Again, when we did this in-depth study in SIRFC, we found that it again comes back to this idea that the subset of farmers that tend to disadopt, it's because the resources that they have are insufficient to enable them to move to sustained adoption. So again, very hard to summarize qualitative data from so many interviews into a neat little figure, but really encourage people to go to the citations that we have down the bottom, or email me if you'd like a paper to start to think about that. But again, it tends to come back to not just the household situation of resources, but the fact that supplementary resources are not there, that community norms are limiting, and that ultimately that policy support or that project support isn't targeting the right resources in order to enable them to get there. One of the interesting pieces of work that we actually did in SIRFC was to look at, okay, those that did make it to sustained adoption, how were they able to overcome the issues that others were having? And it wasn't, again, necessarily that they were the rich farmers. What we actually found was there tended to be a mindset that came, that they approached and they came to the same implementation challenges, but they seem to have a mindset of actually finding strategies to overcome these challenges. And of course, some of that is related to financial resources and risk-bearing capacity, but some of it was also more strongly related into how they approach a challenge that comes in their farming system. So that is actually published in Frontiers in Agronomy as well. So that's worth a read to start to think about, it's not just about identifying challenges to implementation, but it's also about identifying within communities, how did they overcome these? So not just us creating ways to overcome these challenges, but how did those that actually made it to adoption actually overcome those by themselves without intervention? Because that's ultimately what we want with sustained adoption. And one of the points that I made, which was published in Renewable Agriculture and Food Systems, was that we tend to look at something like conservation agriculture, a complex technology, as expanding area over time. The alternative way is to actually look, so that's a very transformational change. What we need is these transitional pathways. So where do we start? Where do we want to get to? Let's change it component by component if you do it correctly. It doesn't mean leading necessarily with zero till, but what are the other components that help enable us to get there? So just quickly finishing off, when we talk about sustained adoption, particularly in South Asia, particularly with mechanization, we can't do that without machines. Now, if we don't have those machines, we can't get adoption. So what we need is service providers. So we've done some specific studies also on service providers. And what we found that although we often ask the question, why do you choose to do or not do zero tillage? Or why do you choose service provision? What we find is this complex mind map of decision-making that comes around zero tillage service provision. So I'm going to put it up, and it's going to be much too small for you to see on your screen. But the idea here is that when we try and go down into decision-making, it's never going to be one reason, but it's going to be a whole confounding mess of different factors that come into decision-making processes. So this is something to consider. If you really want to get to the bottom of why things are happening, you really need to go into the decision process. You need to sit down in a structured way and discuss with the different end users. So this one is a very interesting study on direct-seeded rice in Bihar, published in Rural Studies out of the CSIRO India project. And a final point then is we also have to look at that cultural context. So that definitely comes through when we think about why things do or don't happen. So we've got a study that's in review at the moment that looks at the gendered context of agriculture in the Eastern Gangetic Plains and how those are changing and what opportunities that makes for women's involvement in agriculture and how that implies on how we should promote things, how do we create adoption. So noting that time, one last thing I wanted to mention was that we actually need to also frame adoption not just after the fact, but before the fact. So we've got data that we're looking at in Rupanta that actually looks at what do farmers want to do? Is it crop diversification? Is it livestock diversification? Is it livelihood diversification? So doing that before in order to help that adoption process catalyze more quickly. And of course, we didn't even touch on the technology itself. And if we've got the right thing, what does that mean for a household? How do we actually promote any new practices? So takeaway messages. We started with binary classification, yes and no. We've seen that there's actually these different categories within the process that come. So the challenge that we see in how we frame adoption is to actually pull apart each of those processes to look at how adoption comes together from not knowing, a community not knowing anything to getting these higher adoption rates through awareness, through use, through eventual disadoption as well. I know that that was a big data dump, but I'll just leave you with the fact that we often ask, what is the adoption outcome? What I would challenge everybody when you're thinking about adoption is to think more along the lines of what are the processes that catalyze adoption? Thank you very much. Back to you, Sieg.
Well, this was really, as you said, an impressive amount to think about. So thanks for that. And I will let you moderate your own questions. And there's been some in the chat. I don't know if you can see that. Do you want me to read one of those to you?
That might be useful. It might be hard for me to catch up.
Yeah. So thanks, Victor, for asking, could these farmers have adopted something else, something simpler? Or is it the challenge of not leaving no one behind? Can they just?
So definitely, I think that's where we have to think. So the example that came through for me was that technological substitution example, where we see that, you know, eventually we would hope that we keep getting incrementally better at things. And of course, there is the element of we're simply not providing technologies or creating technologies that can supersede the existing as well. And that might be through various examples of financial poverty traps. So we know from our work in Nepal that conservation agriculture can actually be a poverty trap rather than enabling people to get out of poverty as well. So it's certainly something that we need to consider, and that's on the non-adoption side. Let's not just talk about adoption, but on the non-adoption side.
Other questions? I mean, to me, like I'm sure all of us was so intrigued by all the different aspects of adoption and disadoption. And I think that I would like to hear you at some point talk a little bit more about how you think that you started to get into this, how we can catalyze adoption, particularly using this multifaceted understanding of the process.
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting concept, and I can see just looking through that Victor is sort of asking a similar thing there around, you know, how many of us are actually framing research in this way. I've probably seen, well, one of the reasons I joined the CG was because there was an opportunity for me to work alongside the physical scientists in order to look at how change occurs. And there is this growing sense you can see in, you know, the development of scaling scan, the development of adopt, these other tools that come along. I'm sure there'll be more that come together as one CG forms and we all start to share more ideas. For me, it still comes back to the fact that we still tend to really focus on that binary adoption. What was your adoption rate? Oh, 35% adoption in this area of Kuch Bihar. Well, we don't start to think about, but how was awareness generated? How was familiarity generated? What support mechanisms were in place? And I think that's something that maybe as a cohort, we're still trying to grasp around. So that's why these structured stepwise processes can be a way that we do start to frame that. And I guess I'm also thinking about some of our more econometric scientists as well, where we do like to really look at the characteristics of adopters or non-adopters, whereas maybe we need to look at the characteristics of those that are aware and those that are not, those that are familiar and those that are not, and work our way through this structure to try and garner a little bit more information there.
So I can see that Rachel and then Ava have their hands up. Why don't you go ahead, Rachel, and ask your question?
Sure, I'll chime in. I was listening on my phone and starting to type in the chat and realized it would be way easier just to ask a question. Brendan, this is so interesting. I think you and I chatted a little bit last year, but it's clear we should get in touch and talk more. I wanted to ask a sort of methodological question, I guess. I really feel you on the resistance that you can encounter to getting away from the binary sorts of variables. I mean, I think we're dealing with some of this on the gender side. I think we need to start pushing back against some of the gender disaggregated data emphasis in some ways. And I'm curious to hear your experiences introducing some of these really ideas that introduce a lot of complexity, which is not always appreciated by partners and projects at times. And in particular, thinking about how you've built this sort of structured qualitative approach, I see that as a really interesting way to, you know, take the advantages of qualitative research, but make them applicable, more generalizable, maybe more appreciated at the project level. So that's maybe a request for some comment on those experiences of yours, rather than a direct question.
Definitely, and that's where it is so simple to say 81%, isn't it? Rather than give a 30-minute presentation discussing the complexities around why 81% is not an answer. It is a really tough one because, I mean, particularly, and it's not meant as a denigrating statement, but, you know, we are working with local partners where simplicity is often an easier approach to take than trying to undertake very complex frameworks, very complex thinking that comes in. We're also talking to farmers where they're not even thinking in terms of that sort of adoption as well. So it can be really difficult. What I did, in 4 years in South Asia, was try and talk to every project I could about it and see if they had any interest in funding, you know, certain elements. So that the study on service provision was with CSIRO in India, where I had 5% of my time over a year. So it was just gently chipping away at something until I was actually able to get there, present something, and And I think that was quite well received within CISA India, and they're starting to think in their next project around how they could do a little bit more work around that. Yes, I think unfortunately it's the answer is being overloaded and working on too many projects to try and start to get the message across before before trying to build something more. The other thing that I would mention is one of the things I'm quite proud of from being in South Asia for the last 4 years was building a team of local researchers there in the Nepal office, where we actually, and it's really rare, and I'm sure you'd know, Rachel, as well, that communal coding of qualitative data is really, really difficult. But what we actually did over that COVID period was we actually did communal coding exercises to the point where we actually had 5 different people that worked on coding of our data and still bringing it together as one, but in a unified structure. So something to think about if we do want to expand this sort of work within programs within CG, the qualitative aspects, is around actually investing the time in researchers, and not just IRS, but LRS as well, in order to actually analyze the data. Because when you're collecting 300 interviews, that's a year and a half's work for an individual. How do you actually bring that together? So it's also about the institutional support for that work as well.
Super, thanks.
Great. That's a really good point about the investments needed and coaching and mentoring. I've met your team. All right, so Ava and then Victor, yeah. And maybe Leonard to finish us off.
Well, first, thank you very much for the presentation. I thought it was very interesting, and you did a very thorough analysis throughout the different parts of the adoption process. My question was, you divided the farmers between the people who are familiar use, never assisted, constant user. And my question is, thinking also of the scaling scan, and the scaling ingredients, did you see if there were like enabling conditions and limited factors for each of these groups? No, like if the people who were familiar, it was mainly knowledge, no? And the people who were used, it was mainly finance, or something like this, to also think of the different groups and what are the different necessities amongst those. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting because our approach in our qualitative work was very much around the decision-making processes. So some of those things did come out as we went through, and aptly summarized there, it tends to be finance at a certain level, it tends to be information at a certain level. I think what occurs is the further you go up that chain of adoption, the more diverse the issues got. And as you would expect, by the time you actually get to sustained adoption, then you've just got a whole mind map of 50 different things. And there are some common ones, but there is this diversity that comes around. So I think that's where the need for this more in-depth work comes in. There's definitely a space for all of the tools around scaling. This is sort of a supporting line to see, we can get 10, 15 people in a room and do expert solicitation and these sorts of things. And this is sort of the feeder from the bottom that comes into that as well. In terms of the specific factors, given the 30 minutes, I wasn't able to put everything up, but there's lots of papers that I'd love to share with you that actually point to these different stages. And it would be quite interesting to see as you move down that chain, where does the emphasis tend to come into? But it's not something that I've really formalized in any analysis.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. So I think we're going to still have time for 2 more questions, but it is getting close to the end of the hour. So I'd like to just thank you before we get into the last 2 questions here. So thanks, everyone. The virtual is a very odd way to thank you, people, but I know that we all are very appreciative of your deep dive into this and your really insightful. I know we'll all be thinking about this in different ways. I was actually just encouraged to see adoption and think about it that way, rather than always this feeling like, is there ever any adoption? So just to say how much I appreciated this. All right, so Victor, take it away. What's your question?
Hey, hi, Sig. Hi, Brendan. Oh, sorry, you can't see me. Never mind, not missing much. 3 points. Brendan, is there a connection at all, a beneficial one, between the Genovate qualitative research methodology, the people we train for that? You just described time, effort involved, blah, blah, blah. The local researchers one would need to have. So that's a question. You don't have to answer it, but maybe take it with you. Second, SIG, I really, really, really think it's time that the senior management team of CIMMYT finally commit resources to this kind of research and really make an effort to fundraise for it. I know you're new on the job, but this is not new. We have had these questions again and again. And when I see my pathetic little efforts at getting all the documentation of the adoption dynamics and scaling approach papers for phase 2 of the CRPs, and how difficult it is to get any scientist to spend some time on this, we've got to change motivations here. So that's my message to you. I hope that we can move forward on this, and I'll try to be as helpful as possible. And last but not least, on Rachel's point, and Brendan, maybe you can also respond to this or think about it, the translation of the complexity of your research, I think it can nonetheless still be translated into reasonably manageable game rules of interaction with partners in projects. These people are not stupid. They also know that you have motivations for and against. You can also get them to talk about cultural issues. So it's just a matter of making the space and maybe using different kinds of intervention mechanisms? ? Thank you so much. Really, really enjoyed this.
Thanks, Victor. I'll jump on the ones that I'd like to answer and then claim time on the ones that I wouldn't answer. And so the second one there was a conversation we had at the SAS or the SAS regional meeting where Santiago brought up the fact for more qualitative research, and I stupidly put up my hand and said, well, do we have the resources, time, people, time to train people to actually invest in qualitative research? I think it is starting to get on the radar, but it is something that it certainly doesn't happen very easily or quickly, and you really need that time investment. Because I think the time that I put into training up people over that COVID period, it was probably a period of about 2 months sustained in order to get us to a point there, and even then it was then 6 months of ongoing effort as well. So yeah, there has to be some incentive there that looks at building that. And that was internal. That wasn't with partners either. So if we want to actually then build partners' capacity to understand and implement this sort of work, it really snowballs into something quite huge there as well. But yeah, hopefully it is on the agenda as well.
Absolutely. There's a lot we have going on at once here. All right. So everyone, of course, can leave, and there is a webcast because it's 5 o'clock, but those of us who can stay on for a minute, I would like to hear really Leonard give you the last question here if you're still on. Otherwise, yeah. I'll read from the chat. Please take it over, Leonard.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to take this opportunity to ask something different because I already put my question in the chat. And Brendan, really very impressive presentation. We lost a bit touch during the COVID, but I see you have not been sitting still. Really amazing here. I wonder what has been the response to this kind of, let's say, evidence that you put on the table by, let's say, donors and even partners in, maybe nudging them to change the way that we work. I mean, in scaling, the big problem is basically ourselves, right? The donors that are saying, okay, give us 100,000 farmers by 31st of December. And then you race towards that number and you lose all meaning and value in that, right? Now you show very clearly that it's much more nuanced than that. What has been the response from an ACIAR, a USAID, all those big donors that have been involved in the SURFACE and CISA?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Leonard. I think we often find ourselves digging our own graves on this as well, because money is tied to numbers at the end of the day. If I reflect on the process that we've gone through with ACIAR in South Asia, I think that the presentation of this was part of the lead into the follow-on Rupanta project from SRFSI, in that we really wanted to talk more about processes of change. And one of the things specifically in the Rupanta project document is that one of the things I really encouraged was never stating a number of farmers that we would actually try to implement something to. No number of farmers trained or no number of farmers reached, anything like that. And originally there was this pushback. What is the number? What are you actually doing here? But the way that we actually evolved that and sort of negotiated with that was that this is very much around the fact that if you want to write a project that impacts a number of farmers, then you're missing the broader story of when we integrate with partners, actually create processes of exchange. That's what you're getting out of this. So it became a process project. And we had a small research activity that called roadmaps that came in that very much talked around this is a process-oriented project. We're not going to give you X number of farmers by Y date, but we actually want to show you that this is process. If we get the processes right, in South Asia is the key example. If you get a process right, you're not talking about tens or hundreds or even millions of farmers anymore. You're talking really big numbers. So I think that's when they sort of saw potential and got interested when you show them that, just by sheer population mass, what you can do in a project versus what you can do with establishing processes that help enable adoption, that was their buy-in. But I wouldn't say that's going to be the same with every donor, and I have much more limited experiences with BMGF or with USAID in that negotiation, and I can see that it's probably going to be harder, particularly with USAID, because they do like those numbers. But I think as much as we're talking about processes, it was actually the journey that came through from the SRA, from CERFC, from my lobbying over several years to try and move away from, you were there with the writing of CERFC variations as well, trying to move away from 1 million farmers by this date, actually bringing them on a process of change as well.
Thanks, Brendan. Great.
I think that's one of your biggest contributions, really, to get beyond ticking boxes that we've adopted. It's always been a huge concern, many of us in ag development. So thank you, Brendan, for all you're doing, and look forward to working with you in different formats in the future. So I just wanted I put in the chat, the next SAS presentation is going to be my journey at CIMMYT, looking back to move forward together. So kind of similar theme to yours, Brendan. So that will be on Tuesday, the 9th of August, from 8 to 9 o'clock Mexican time. So thanks again, Brendan. Let's stay in touch. And now I have some really interesting papers. I've only read your more recent one. So this is, you've really shown me this body of work that you've done. Thank you again. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. If you want any papers, just email me. Thank you. Bye-bye.